Everybody, wait a minute. Everybody, wait a minute. Well, everybody, wait a minute.
They say when you wear Black Power Media gear, you can accomplish anything. You can play any and every position. Coaching, to kicking, to receiving, to running and juking. Oh my goodness, I see that again in slow motion. Get off me. And you're going to have a lot of haters coming at you, but what you got to do is you got to shake them off, and get to your goal and accomplish it. And when that's done, it's a beautiful thing. I'm talking about going hard, extra, for that extra point. And when it's done beautifully, you talking about touchdown. Oh, and the crowd goes wild and they're celebrating with you and everything. Man, let's see that again. Nice.
Black Power Media, baby. That's how we do it.
Now go to blackpowermedia.org and get you some of that gear. Empower yourself today. Yeah.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here, Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. A little bit different this one, pre-recorded episode that I'm doing a few days in advance. So I'm sure a lot will have happened in the interim regarding this topic, but at the same time, I don't think a lot of people are addressing this topic in the way that I hope to. So I know a lot of people are sick and tired of hearing about celebrity, hearing about Kanye and all of that other kind of good stuff. But there's a couple things about this issue that I've noticed that don't get really addressed in the way that I would like to once again. So I hope folks will bear with me and check it out, and obviously let me know what you think. We'll continue the discussion, and I look forward to being back very soon with live broadcasts. So if you have anything, any issue with what I'm saying or my approach, or have any comments, criticisms, conundrums, catechisms, cacophony, condemnation, contemplation, consternation, just
put it in the comments,
and we'll get to it. So, all right. So obviously, folks have been aware of what has gone on recently with Kanye West, and what are sort of the reverberating discussions around his comments. So what I would like to do is now, and as it turns out, as I think I mentioned not too long ago, I had actually been asked for my thoughts on this, and that story just came out, I think very recent, the other day, well, a couple of days ago now, actually, and I didn't even realize it. So I'm going to start there, but I think it will help us get to where I would like us to go. So, all right, so let's start with this article that came out a little while ago in the Baltimore Banner by Leslie Gray Streeter, with whom I had a very nice discussion about all of this. At one point, Kanye West's recent controversies have made headlines. Why can't we stop talking about him? And this came out on the 13th, so it's by the time this airs is already a week or so old. But as she starts off, a lot of people are talking about what Kanye West said this week. Of course, the rapper, fashion designer, one-time presidential candidate, and recent conservative provocateur, now formerly known as Ye, has created so much controversy lately that it's hard to pick out which thing anyone's talking about. So for me, and what is of interest to most to me, or what has been brought to me, whether it's students, comrades, family, in terms of what are my thoughts about this, and including this journalist here, what did I think about this, is obviously what he has said related to Jews, and that's sort of the point of my what I want us to get to this morning on this edition of yays and yarmulkes. So where, for whatever reasons, Kanye West went to Twitter and said he's going to go to DEFCON 3 on Jewish people. Of course, he meant DEFCON, and of course, that means defense condition. And of course, 1 is the most threatening, 5 is the most safe. So I think, not knowing what he was talking about, he went with 3, so it was right in the middle, and that he was going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people. He later came back, and it was revealed in that Fox News, that in his interview with Tucker Carlson, who everybody, including the white left, seems to want to spend time with to reach a broader, growing populist movement. But in what was cut out of that interview was Ye saying something to the effect that he wanted to teach his kids more about Hanukkah than Kwanzaa, because at least that would come with some financial literacy. Wasn't the word he used, but it was just another one of those tropes. We're going to come back to his comments in a little bit, but all of that stuff about Jews and the economy, and Jews and their culture, and Jews being the standard bearers for what oppressed groups like Black people should do, all of this kind of stuff. so that's what was of most interest to me in terms of hearing what Kanye had to say. And of course, this is what brought people, including I think this journalist, why I was encouraged as someone that this journalist should reach out to. Anyway, again, stuff we'll come back to. So as she writes here, that is, Streeter, whether or not you agree with West's opinions, you've probably at least heard about them because the stories and discussions are everywhere. But why? It's complicated, but it might come down to the Instagram era amplification of the views of influencers and celebrities over, say, the voices of activists and academics, says Dr. Jared Ball, professor of multimedia production at Morgan State University. So I know Morgan has not updated its website in the last couple of years, and my page in particular, but I am no longer in multi-platform production in the School of Global Journalism and Communication. I am in the AAAD, or African American African Diaspora Studies program. I am its, I think, lone sort of exclusive faculty member. And then I also teach courses in the sociology department. And I think I'm housed officially within history and geography. So, but I am, but professionally, I am a tenured full professor of communication studies and Africana studies, or as I like to say, Africana studies, Black studies, etc. So that's what I'm doing there. But and then as we'll come back to, I think this is, she comes close. We spoke for, I mean, almost 2 hours. We had a really good conversation, a good time talking. And obviously I knew not all of it's going to end up in there, but it was a good conversation nonetheless. But that's not exactly what I meant. It sort of gets to what I meant, but not exactly, but we can come back to that. If people don't like what he said about Jews, for instance, where is the substantive discussion on Jewish and Black relationships? Where does this take place? Really, nowhere in the mainstream, says Ball. Neither side is making room for honest conversations about this. If that was happening on the regular, Kanye or Nick Cannon, who had his own controversy over anti-Semitic remarks in 2020, saying something stupid, wouldn't need to be published. So this gets more to the point of what I was trying to convey and what I am trying to convey, that I don't like any of what I consider to be the disingenuous conversation in most of the popular public discourse around this subject, from Black outlets, white outlets, etc. A lot of the hip hop YouTube community, I'm not enjoying almost any of the conversation, largely because it remains focused on Kanye West, his mental health, whether what he said was anti-Semitic, whatever. And I think all of that misses what for me is the more important point, which is that no one in power, no one in certainly dominant commercial media spaces wants an honest and ever hosts or encourages an honest discussion of Black history, Jewish history, the relationship between the two communities, the histories of the two communities. Like, none of this is honestly and substantively discussed. So it's done, I think, intentionally to leave room for a lot of the conspiracy, a lot of the mythology, a lot of the hostility to just go unchecked on all sides. And I think that's the goal of those in power, to not have in any area, this one chief among them, honest and accurate conversations. And then what we end up with is room for, and I'll continue to come back to this, for people like Kanye and Nick Cannon to jump out here and to take up an undue amount of space in the conversation. And in fact, let me just stop here for a quick second, because I think, and just clarify, and I probably should have started here, and just clarify what are in fact my concerns and what I tried to convey in this interview and what I'll try to convey in this video. Again, I don't usually like to do it this way, and I'm not a fan when others do it, but I get it. My particular background being a product of a brief, loving relationship and marriage between a Black man and a European descended Jewish woman. my mother, who raised me with a certain set of, I think, positive mythologies around all of this and pushed me to a certain political trajectory. A correct one, by the way, one that I think both Black and Jewish communities miss out on, quite frankly. Something I'll come back to a little bit here this morning as well. But because of that, and because of the particular approach that I've been encouraged toward in studying the histories of these communities and their actual and honest relationship, my parents notwithstanding, it's frustrating when this kind of stuff happens, and especially when I know that this is the goal. We want uninformed discussion just in general, with smatterings of truth that can be easily played upon, preyed upon, and manipulated. So my general concerns are popular discussions of Israel, Jews, Black-Jewish relations, just like all other issues, particularly those related to struggles for power, are intentionally narrowed, limited, framed to support the broader colonial project. Check all my other work for details on that. Number two. So let me just say, again, number one, popular discussions of Israel, Jews, Black-Jewish relations, etc., just like all other issues, particularly those related to struggles for power, are intentionally narrowed, limited, framed to support, are intentionally narrowed or limited and framed to support the broader colonial project. Again, check all my other work for that. Number two, there is no genuine interest in investigating the origins of stereotypes or why celebrities both exist and are then often encouraged to speak on matters beyond their art, talent, or expertise. There is no genuine interest in investigating the origins or stereotypes or why celebrities both exist and are often encouraged to speak on matters beyond their art, talent, or expertise. Third point, into this vacuum, and I'm going to come to this, comes the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, which can establish the dominant conservative narrative against which all else must submit. So I know that sounds like and maybe is a sharp segue or shift, but I'm going to come to that in a minute, because I think a lot of the response that we get and a lot of the discussion is driven around a very prescribed political narrative set and protected by the ADL. And then lastly, but the histories behind why all of this is less about Jews and more about European imperialism gets lost. The differences between Judaism and Zionism get lost. And the theft of the theft all of this is meant to mask goes undiscussed. So those are sort of I didn't get to that with this. I didn't get to the ADL and the colonialism part with my interview that I'm going to come back to here. But that's sort of the approach that I want to encourage in how we analyze and respond to these kinds of stories, which are going to continue to happen and pop up. We know historically that this has gone on repeatedly, famously with obviously Professor Griff and Public Enemy, but it comes up routinely, whether it's Jesse Jackson's Hymietown or obviously the ongoing backs and forth with the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan, or any Deshaun Jackson recently, Nick Cannon. We're constantly having these, and then we know what the deal is. Off the record, we all know what's what. We all know what the conversations are, particularly in the Black community. What we don't often know is the perspective or the discussions that do or don't occur within the Jewish community. I'm no expert in that. But I would suggest at least that they don't often consist of honest, substantive, meaningful conversations with and about Black people in terms of the history of these two communities and how they end up interacting. All right. So then Streeter, coming back to this article here, I kind of felt like she kind of threw me out. It was almost like I felt like for a second here I got thrown under the bus, because she comes back and says, so after I've made my point that neither side is making room for conversations about this, and then we get left with Kanye and Nick Cannon, Streeter comes back to say, I don't have a problem with Kanye West publicly sharing his views with the expected criticism that might come from them, because I've never been a fan of the shut up and dribble discourse that holds that celebrities don't get to have an opinion. You don't give up your First Amendment rights when you pick a profession. He has a right to his opinion, although I do think his opinion should stop at hate speech or threats. It's the onus we put on those views that's curious. So one, and again, we'll come back to this, I don't equate what Kanye West said with legit threats of violence, what is broadly described as anti-Semitism, or the rise of a new anti-Semitism, which has its own history that I'm not going to get into in this discussion. And I'm not really an expert in anyway, but it's this argument among among conservative Jews that there is always a rise of a new anti-Semitism that has to be protected against, and of course, as we're going to come back to, fundraised for, in preparation for, and of course, that requires an unbiting, uncritical defense of Israel and Zionism, and the political behavior of conservative Jews. But so when I read this part of the article, I was kind of, I felt a little bit kind of way that I felt like in the extended conversation that we had, that I never suggested. In fact, I said specifically the opposite, that I don't think artists should be confined to a shut up and dribble perspective. What I am saying is that there is an intention, there is a structural, institutional preference for uninformed discussion that leaves room for uninformed celebrities to give and have an undue level of input and relevance in these discussions. So it doesn't mean that Kanye should not have a right to his opinion. It does mean that I think there is a specific intent among those in power to ask him what his opinion is on these and related issues, as opposed to talking to others about their views, which might, by the way, rise above the level of opinion and might reach the level of actual analysis. So that's what I meant. And so when I read that, I was like, what are we really trying to do here? But as she comes back to say later on, of course, West isn't the first celebrity to be publicly political, with everyone from musician Paul Robeson to actor Harry Belafonte to boxer Muhammad Ali to actress Jane Fonda lending their voices to various social causes. The difference, Ball says, is that those artists were strongly connected to other established figures who were at the forefront of these conversations. So that was part of my point. So I'm glad she at least came back to that point. Because I'm not, in fact, just saying that artists should not have a right to speak. I'm saying that, again, artists and others are intentionally selected for comment because of their inexpertise and their lack of direct engagement with political struggle movements and organizations and activists. This is also what I've said historically was the difference between people like Belafonte, Robeson, Muhammad Ali, and others, was that they had a more thriving, organized movement upon which to lean and with which to engage, that had its own more, I think, authentic leadership to speak for it. And particularly when it comes to people like Robeson, they were wildly, deeply engaged in the organization and the efforts and of those movements. They weren't just swooping in, being asked to give comment. And then quite the opposite, particularly with Robeson, but also obviously with Muhammad Ali and Belafonte. All of them were punished in terms of their career and in terms of being invited to comment because of their political positions. And as I say later in this piece, and I'm glad she included that, this is why you would have at one point seen a William F. Buckley interviewing Huey P. Newton on national television, but you would never see a conversation like that today with somebody that far left, that is as Newton in those spaces. Also, Ball says West would get less media attention if he were really talking about the connections between, say, money and power, things that might rustle the apple cart. If there was a legit conversation about Zionism or the corporate ownership of fashion, it wouldn't necessitate the knee-jerk, silly posts, Ball says. It would be like, oh, you're so out of vogue. We're going back to our conversation now, he says. If we wanted to go beyond that, we'd have to have some serious conversations about that would make people like Kanye moot. I'm glad she included this. I wasn't sure this part would make the story because references to Zionism aren't always as welcomed. But this is what I was at least trying to say, was that were we having more substantive conversations like this on a regular basis, or where those conversations do take place, people like Kanye don't have a lot of room. There's not a lot of room made for them and what they think about it. But because there's very little to no discussion of Zionism and the actual relationship between Black communities and Jewish communities and those histories, when people like Kanye pop up, they're seen as, again, out of place, hostile, and then easily targeted as representing some sort of dominant worldview that has been sort of self-generated as opposed to imposed or encouraged. So Black people didn't create Kanye as a celebrity. Black people didn't create Kanye as a spokesperson for their politics. The white world, the white corporate world did all of that, created his celebrity, created his position to comment, invited those comments. Obviously, that's why Tucker Carlson has him on there. Obviously, that's why they edit the interview so that they can get all the salacious stuff out. And as others have pointed out, they can leave, they can cut out certain things, like when Kanye said he was vaccinated. They apparently didn't want to include that part. Anyway, so the link to that article is in the show description if you want to see it in its completeness. But I am glad to have at least had the opportunity to quickly to try to lay out a couple of those points about that. My biggest concern is not what Kanye said, but that he is positioned and encouraged to say it, and then is used for broader political purposes of limiting discussions, of inhibiting certain critiques, particularly of Zionism, and then a very slick thing. We're left with a situation where Jews can both be used by society to be blamed for everything, and then have that even have that position to be set up for blame be protected by claims of anti-Semitism, when that position that I think is falsely constructed, we'll come back to a little bit, is critiqued. It's wild. It's wild. So that was so I wanted to just try to inject some of that into this discussion. By the way, so it also reminded me of what I had once written some years ago for Black Agenda Report. Back when I think I mentioned before, when Drake was given I think in 2006 he was given Jew of the Year award, and then he and Obama were said to be the most visible mulattoes at the time in 2014. And I'll include the link to this as well, just in case. But one important thing from this piece that was it was from originally from 2010 was that I got my favorite quote from Lorraine Hansberry in it, where I'm saying here, to separate the conditions of Black people, broadly speaking, from the individual success story of this or that individual is a grave mistake. She said that, quote, to destroy the abstraction for the sake of the specific is in this case an error. And it was in response to her being asked a question about how can people be expected to think that Black people are struggling when they can see celebrities like Lorraine Hansberry doing so well. And she said to destroy the abstraction for the sake of the specific is in this case an error. So in other words, to destroy the abstraction of the horrors of Black existence in favor of the specific case of a Drake or a Kanye or an Obama is an error. But my point in bringing this up today is because my concerns around what's happening with Kanye were concerns I expressed back then regarding this issue of Drake. And I get it's different. Kanye's talking about Jews. Drake, as a Jew, is being positioned as a mulatto Black Jew and prominent spokesperson on behalf of all of those groups. So then I ask here, so what I wrote here was, so I now add a few more questions in response to those asking my opinion of Drake based on my similar yet quite different background. Does Drake's being a Jew further connect that community to its own radical traditions? Do discussions of Drake's Judaism lead to increased socialist formation or criticism of Zionism as the Western European imperial project of Theodore Herzl himself claimed, or the blunt instrument against the Jewish tendency towards Bolshevism, as Winston Churchill said it was? In other words, Churchill and his crew said they needed Zionism as a bulwark against the tendency of Jews towards Bolshevism or socialism or communism. Drake says he is going to Israel soon. Does this mean he is breaking the anti-apartheid boycott of performances there that many have accepted in alliance with Palestinian liberation? Is that hip hop? What happened to Sun City? Does his Blackness mean an adherence to the long-standing Black radical position which holds that the cause of the Palestinians is ours? Will his being a Jew and Black help advance the relationship of those two communities? Do discussions of Drake's Blackness help us better understand the dynamics of the latest publications from the Nation of Islam, or why Michael Eric Dyson felt compelled to follow his interview with Farrakhan by ones with critics Abraham Foxman and Stanley Crouch? I'm going to come back to Abraham Foxman and the ADL here in a minute. But this is sort of what I'm trying to say. Like, do we really, in other words, what I'm really saying, obviously I'm saying there is no honest intent to have Drake's celebrity, or in this case, Kanye's celebrity, be used to have us better understand any of these histories. They're used for quite the opposite purposes. And I think that, so again, when Kanye pops off, or Nick Cannon pops off, or Drake or somebody pops off, there's no honest, it's almost welcomed despite the complaints and the condemnation, because it reminds, or it keeps everybody limited to these narrow conversations. Jews own everything. Jews control everything. You know, Black people should try to be more like Jews. If Black people are more like Jews, we could do blah, 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 blah. All of this is madness. Ahistorical, anti-historical, and confused. So in my reference in that piece to the Nation of Islam, I was talking about their reissuing of the secret relationship between Blacks and Jews, who, and I admit it wasn't my strongest interview with Cedric Robinson at the time when I was at WPFW. But what I was trying to get with him without, I didn't want to be seen as, what I didn't want to do was be seen as just another one condemning the nation as anti-Semitic. But I was trying to raise what's up with the historical slant that you just find every Jew who's done something wrong in history, which is the exact opposite of what Jews and others do in trying to promote Jews as having some grand, special relationship, pun intended, in saving Black people, where Jews go just sort of cherry pick the history of Jews only being on the good side. Obviously, history is much more complicated than that, but we can't have an honest discussion of that. Let me keep going. I'm going to come back to some of that as well. So, okay. So I just wanted to quickly at least raise or, point that out again, that just a general skepticism, cynicism at hearing the concerns and the popular discussion of Kanye, of being an anti-Semite, or of defending Kanye as telling the truth about Jews and being punished for it. I think both, all of that is missing many of the key points. And one of those key points, as I've sort of mentioned already, is that, again, more time and with greater expertise than I can offer, it needs to be brought to this discussion. But whatever we think of our own identity or the identity of others or our own people's behavior or those of others, we have to also recognize that beyond our own views are the views that others have and the way others use or attempt to misuse the behavior and perspectives of different groups for their own political purposes. So we already can point to, for instance, with all the nonsense about Kanye being an anti-Semite, we can point to some broader context in history for how claims of anti-Semitism are meant to play politically. For anyone to... It's one thing to be critical of what Kanye's had to say. It's one thing not to like what Kanye's had to say. It's one thing to be defensive about what Kanye has had to say. It's another to not understand the differences between an angry Black celebrity and organized state power to commit genocide or suppress a group of people. So this idea that Kanye is in league with or representative of or capable of or powerful enough to enact some anti-Semitic power over Jews is part of the mythology. To misunderstand or not understand at all how claims of anti-Semitism are used as a defense of conservative right-wing politics, colonialist politics, Zionist politics is, again, to be confused about and to be missing the point about how attacks of even Kanye are being used. Again, I'm going to come back to keep coming to this. So I just want to share a little bit of this great documentary, Occupation of the Mind, for this quick, brief, just this short section on how the state of Israel, now I know this is not exactly the same, but how the state of Israel brought in Frank Luntz and other popular marketing, advertising, psychological warfare experts to rebrand their politics in the world. All right. And I think it adds an important context to understanding what's happening now in the discussion and the critique and the misinterpretation, many of them misinterpretations around what Kanye West is saying.
2 years after the Lebanon invasion, the American Jewish Congress sponsored a conference in Jerusalem to devise a formal public relations strategy known in Hebrew as Hasbara. Participants included PR and advertising executives, media specialists, journalists, and leaders of major Jewish groups. According to a brochure from the Congress, No single event brought home the need for a more effective Hasbara or information program more persuasively than the 1982 war in Lebanon and the events that followed. As one conference participant put it, Israel is no longer perceived to be Little David, but Goliath steamrolling across the map. The primary aim of the conference was to develop strategies to spin unpopular Israeli policies and to counter negative press coverage by shaping the media frame in advance. News doesn't just jump into a camera, a conference delegate said. It's directed, it's managed, it's made accessible. Israel-based advertising executive Martin Fenton would put it in even more blunt terms. Propaganda is not a dirty word, he said. Face it, we are in the game of changing people's minds, of making them think differently. To accomplish that, we need propaganda. The conference was chaired by US advertising executive Carl Spielvogel, the legendary ad man who created the highly acclaimed Miller Lite beer ads in the 1970s.
The choice of Spielvogel makes perfect sense. He's known as a master of image inversion and rebranding. The ad man responsible for transforming Miller Lite, which had been viewed before as a woman's beer, into a manly beer that tough guys would drink.
The best part is that it tastes so great. The best part is it's less filling. Nah, it tastes great. Less filling.
His job with Israel would require the same kind of rebranding, only in the opposite direction, to help soften the image of a country that's coming to be seen as a bully. So he recommends creating a cabinet post dedicated exclusively to explaining policy, whose job would not be setting policy, but presenting it in the most attractive way to the rest of the world.
So again, I'm not arguing that there is a one-to-one connection or even certainly no cause and effect. I'm just saying there's a parallel between the broader colonialist mission of the West, and in this case of Zionism and the state of Israel, and this idea that criticism of what Jews in power or the state of Israel do is in and of itself anti-Semitic. I then also think that there would be need to be more discussion, again, as I sort of alluded to, around the differences between, again, angry, even hateful comments and organized institutional state power that can act on those hateful comments. Again, I don't think it's too far afield from, can Black people be racist? Can Black people be anti-Semitic? I think given the conditions and the history of Black people, no, and we would need to look a little bit more carefully at what is being said, advocated, and then again, what power is in place to act on any of those views. But again, more importantly, my point is that when someone like Kanye says what he says, the criticism of him, the media, the punditry, the focus, their focus on him and what he said is not only done intentionally based on the consumer or the corporate interests of capitalist media, but on the political interests of European and Western imperialism and the role Zionism plays in that project. So that's where I think that there's some overlap here. So again, as a subset of that project, of that colonialist Zionist project, comes the defense akin to what, and by the way, if you look at the rest of that Occupation of the American Mind documentary and others, I mean, there's other sources, but it's really good for a number of different things, but also in terms of, but specifically for us in this discussion of setting that political context for how claims of anti-Semitism or how approaches to these issues in media are to be handled or are handled from the perspective of those in the West. They set sort of the trajectory for all of that very well in that documentary by, again, explaining that this is not a legit concern about a threat to Jews per se. what they do is they rebrand as a threat to Jews any threat to the Western imperial project of Zionism, which requires a suppression of Palestinians and of criticism of those politics in the diaspora, which is where we come to our good friends Abraham Foxman and the ADL. Abraham Foxman, the longtime famous head of the ADL, who was mentioned in that piece, and I think I'm looking it up here very quickly. I think he stepped down. He was the director of the ADL from 87 to 2015. Oh, you know what? So I have to update a joke I have that I share with close friends off the record about. It's a very, very inappropriate joke about what I think of the off the record behavior of Foxman and Farrakhan. Okay, and the current head of the ADL is Jonathan Greenblatt. Okay, so I have to update some of my jokes here. But turning to Greenblatt and formerly Foxman, who headed up the Anti-Defamation League, they came out the other day with their thoughts about Kanye, unpacking Kanye West's anti-Semitic remarks. They write, on October 6th, Ye joined Fox News' Tucker Carlson after his decision to wear White Lives Matter shirt at Paris Fashion Week garnered heightened media attention. During the interview, some of which was not aired on Fox that evening, Ye made a series of offensive and conspiratorial claims about Jewish people and Jewish identity. Ye claimed that Jews are actually Black people, saying that when he refers to Jews, he means the 12 lost tribes of Judah, the blood of Christ, who the people known as the race Black people really are, and posited and that Planned Parenthood was the product of a collaboration between the KKK and Margaret Sanger to control the Jew, i.e. Black population. He also said that it is impossible for him to be fairly described as anti-Semitic because as a Black person, he is actually a Jew. So while, again, without getting into it, I'm certainly not an expert, but I've seen, a good amount of the historical, at least some of the research arguing about, historically that including my favorite from Sigmund Freud himself, that Judaism originates in Africa. The original Jews or Hebrews were themselves African, and that Europeans, a segment of the European population currently identified as Jews, came into the picture later. Now, obviously, people debate what that means as either usurpers or part of the diaspora created during the Great Dispersal, or one of the Great Dispersals of Jews in the early centuries CE, I believe. Whatever. What I think is always funny about this is, again, my own ancestry DNA reveal, which. And I used to have a loving little argument, with my mother about this, that if Jews aren't supposed to be seen as a specific sect of Europeans and is supposed to be seen as universal, as espousing a universal religion, why then is there a specific genetic identity for Jews? And as my ancestry DNA came back showing that, and it's even changed to increase the percentage to now 50%. Now I'm 50% European Jew. So from their perspective, DNA identifies a specific European Jewish, biological line, I guess, or whatever. Again, calling into question what it means then to have it be considered a universal religion. But anyway, my point is in all of that is that from that really my point for this discussion is that none of the what would be fascinating substantive history around the African origins of Judaism and what that could mean in a handholdy way for the unity of all humans, we don't get that. We get everybody retreating to their nationalisms, retreating to their religions, and defending them. Again, that's why Sigmund Freud wrote his book, Moses or Monotheism. He wanted to investigate the psychological trauma imposed on a group of people whose national myth of origin, in this case, Jews realizing Moses was African, was not real. But we don't have any of that fascinating conversation. We get what we get. So when Kanye, so does the ADL want, do they welcome? I don't pretend to read their publications. Maybe I've missed it. Do they pretend to want to have an honest conversation about where does Kanye get that analysis or that conclusion from? Are they really interested in that? Is anyone actually interested in that? Where are the prolonged, repetitive, for all the discussion of Jews in media, owning media, Jews being subjects in media, Jews, where are the discussions with and or about Jews about the overlaps in African history? Or even just from their own perspective, discussion of the history of Jews. It doesn't exist. It doesn't happen. So we're again, I'm arguing, left intentionally with a situation where uninformed snippets can be invited and used for the recreation of a cycle. One that is oddly in support of colonialism. Ye stated that he wished his children had learned about Hanukkah instead of a complicated Kwanzaa, because Hanukkah would at least come with some financial engineering. So again, we get it. Everybody, we understand that everybody is encouraged to the stereotype that Jews run money in the banking industry. And when we find by percentage or per capita percentages, whatever, perhaps an overrepresentation in that industry or in media or in other industries, for instance, medical, in medicine, et cetera, of Jews, we're left with conspiracies instead of actual legit histories that could explain why Jews are at least seen, if not actually dominant or predominant by percentage of population in those areas. And my argument would be that Jews don't do enough to share these histories and explanations. Now, see, this is where, and I'm going to come back to, I think I'll mention this again in a minute when we come to something else, but this is where we come to this thing of this contradiction in the history of Jews, of European Jews, of wanting to assimilate into the societies created by their European conquerors, fellow European conquerors in many cases, and wanting to remain relatively distinct and yet anonymous. And I don't mean anonymous to be shady, but anonymous for self-preservation. Those histories aren't well understood or discussed even among Jews. And Jews, even in some of the literature, discuss why Jews don't want to have those discussions, because they don't want people to be discussing them. They don't want, because they're conditioned through experience in Europe, not in Africa, not in Asia or the so-called Middle East, but through their experiences in Europe, European Jews have been conditioned to not want attention. When those attention levels go up, here comes the pogroms, here come the Holocaust, here comes the violence. Here comes the forced relegation into areas of business and later in media that they're now blamed for having control over. but those histories aren't discussed even by Jews who have a deeper desire. By the way, it kind of reminds me of my argument about hip hop and the desire to defend hip hop's existence. Its early narrative constructors or constructionists missed many of the key beginnings of sets of antagonisms that still exist to this day, meaning the corporate colonial takeover or control of the art used against the people. Jews, in a similar desire to remain out of the Soren's eye of white folks, said, let's tell their stories. Let's write their Christmas songs and let's tell their narratives and their myths of origin so that they don't look at us, because whenever they look at us, it gets violent. Because who better than other white folks to know that white folks are quick to violence? But that doesn't happen. We don't get that. So we're intentionally left with a situation where somebody would say financial engineering. Years ago, I remember I was doing radio then, and Kanye had come out and said something like he wanted to wish a happy Hanukkah to all of the Jews who run the music industry or something. And there was a 2006 article I used to use all the time in the LA Times, written by a Jew who almost did one of the things, kind of started to do what I was talking about, but did it in a way that was satirical and not meant to be, that wasn't ultimately helpful. And his point was to make fun of the conspiracy that Jews were running media by showing how Jews were in all the dominant positions in media. But instead of using that to tell the history of why they end up there, that article just was making fun of the conspiracy theories and saying, basically, you should be grateful because without us Jews running Hollywood, the United States would not have a Hollywood and a movie industry that it loves so much. Which is I think that's fine. That's a funny way to approach it, but it would be much more helpful to include in that approach, here's some history as to why Jews ended up there. And it has nothing to do with Jews run everything and it's a conspiracy. It has a much more logical history going back to the history of Europe, the rise of mercantilism, capitalism, the histories of religion and the belief, the I'm trying to be polite, but the unsubstantiated belief in Jesus and Christianity and what Jews are said to have had in relationship, all of that. Jews killed Christ and all this other kind of nonsense, all this other kind of stuff, and blah, blah, blah. But we all know in Black communities and everywhere else, that still exists as a belief that undergirds a lot of all of this. Now, my point is I'm trying to focus on here is that the ADL, conservative Jews, Zionists of all backgrounds, etc., are happy to have these little things, this permeate because they know Black people aren't going. Black people aren't. There's no threat to Jews coming from Black people. But what can be done, going back to occupation of the American mind, is that claims of anti-Semitism can be used to justify conservative Jewish and broadly speaking political behavior that is colonialist, etc. And that's why I'm always so frustrated by these conversations. Saying that what Kanye West said was dangerous rhetoric that may help advance the spread of existing false and anti-Semitic narratives shared by extremist groups. Again, ADL, Jews everywhere of all political backgrounds, stripes, shapes, colors, etc. The best way to help deal with these anti-Semitic narratives shared by these false and anti-Semitic narratives shared by extremist groups is to demonstrate the inaccuracy of the claims by sharing the history, both good and bad. That is, again, for instance, one of the reasons why Black people often have negative views of Jews is because their only interaction with Jews is at points of hostile, negative interactions based on unequal power relationships. There is also no institutional, never has been, any institutional, state-driven, collective, national Jewish support for Black liberation. Jews have played individually and in small groups pivotal roles in a lot of progressive and revolutionary things in this world, even in support of Black liberation, including supporting the funding of John Brown. And the person, I think there were a number of Jews in his crew, out, at least fighting out west, if not at Harper's Ferry, or in the Midwest, and if not at Harper's Ferry. Moses somebody was one of his funders that funded him and supported his work. And of course, it was Judah P. Benjamin who helped organize the Confederacy. So again, that was my point with Cedric Muhammad. It's like we could cherry pick Jews, make them look like heroes. We could cherry pick Jews and make them all look like villains. But in neither case do we get an honest understanding of what happens. And my point again here is how, at least in this case, conservative Jews in particular don't want to participate in sharing the accuracy of their own histories, in part because they don't want that any undue attention. And if any attention on their communities is going to be brought, it's in defense of Israel and in condemnation of anything that could be considered anti-Semitic. So then this is my favorite part about the ADL. And this is honestly where my little jokes about the nation, about Foxman and Farrakhan come in. And I don't really mean to suggest that there's an actual parallel here. And that's why I probably even shouldn't be sharing my off the record joke. Which I'm not even really sharing, I'm just referring to, which probably makes it even worse. But my point is that, because it is a false equivalent to suggest that the Nation of Islam and the ADL are opposing, or that Black people and Jews as communities are equitably placed in society and in the world. But my real point is that there is, I think, an ignoble abuse of the abuses suffered by any community when members of their community take advantage of it for fundraising and to bolster their political position. The ADL definitely does this. The ADL definitely does this. There is no reason for Jews anywhere in the world to be writing about or concerned with the Black Hebrew Israelites, both in terms of their analysis or their impact on Black people or the world. To suggest that Black people at all even know who this group is, I promise you the ADL knows more about the Black Hebrew Israelites than the average Black person. I promise you that. I'm sure. I can almost feel it. But obviously, to this or anything else, you got something to say?
Put it in the comments.
You want to tell me?
It's wrong, bro.
Go ahead. But I know for a fact. Now, I don't know for a fact. I am confident, at least in saying, that the ADL knows way more about the Black Hebrew Israelites than the average Black person. But yet the ADL can bring them up because they can be used to bolster the ADL's position that the ADL needs to exist and raise money for its conservative project, because there is this lingering threat against Jews that these Black people are a part of. So they don't even take the time to say things like, look, these folks they exist, but they're nowhere near a threat like these white folks are. Like like we've been oppressing the Arabs in the Middle East for 150 years or whatever, or more, 200 years or whatever at this point, but officially since 1948. And there's been no organized institutional Arab rise against Jews. Black people have never risen institutionally, collectively against Jews. White people have risen institutionally and collectively against Jews for hundreds and thousands of years in multiple countries. And yet included in all the discussion of those groups are little groups like the Black Hebrew Israelites, the Nation of Islam, no disrespect by calling them little, and then Kanye West. This is disingenuous. And what I'm saying is that this, starting with the ADL, even when people don't realize that the ADL is playing this role in setting a narrative, these talking points trickle down everywhere and get picked up all over the place. So they pick on the Black Hebrew Israelites. Then they, of course, pick on the Nation of Islam. Kanye hanging out with Farrakhan. There's that picture of Kanye when he was with Kim Kardashian, with Farrakhan and his family. So the Nation of Islam supporting interracial marriage now? It's like I'm just playing. By the way, there's no discussion among the ADL that Semitic is a linguistic group, not a race or religion, that includes Arabs and Africans in it. So it's just, it's just, and then they come back to Jews control the media and recording industry, referring to it as a trope, something that is promoted notoriously, as they say here, by anti-Semitic leader Louis Farrakhan. So, but again, this is sort of my point, going back even to that 2006 article from the LA Times that I can't, I'd have to dig up, or someone would have to dig up. But the point was there that, yeah, but from a Jewish writer saying, yeah, Jews run all this stuff, but you're welcome. Because if we start going through it, well, who does own the music industry? Who does control the music industry? Who does manage and control all of these platforms? Many of them are Jews. And certainly as I've looked at in my own work, if you look at the relationship, in many others before me, after me, parallel to me, if you look at the relationship between the media industry, all told, Hollywood, television, print, music, the relationship is not a good one when it comes to Black people. But even from the perspective of Jews, instead of having an honest discussion of what Jews have done in terms of their role institutionally working within these media apparatuses, or how they got there, what they do when they're there, and what impact this has on different communities, and why different communities might end up looking at one another differently. No, they just throw it into the pot of anti-Semitism and throw it up against the wall of the internet to say, look, you all just keep saying we're all about financial engineering and controlling money, and it just reinforces a stereotype. Kanye in 2013 being quoted here saying, I talked to Farrakhan last night and he told me not to apologize. I ain't finna apologize. Ye and Farrakhan have expressed mutual respect and support for one another on other occasions as well. So then this just becomes another way to get it at Farrakhan. And here we go with them getting at Rizza Islam. But again, some of us have been critical of Rizza Islam. Specifically, I know I was critical of Rizza Islam for being placed by Black conservatives like Boyce Watkins and given platform space to offer what I think are his conservative views, his reactionary views in terms of the condition of Black people and what Black people should do about it. And for Dr. James Small to call him a threat akin to Malcolm X in these media spaces, I think that we've already talked about. I thought that was that's not accurate. But the ADL and their political colleagues, peers, they're not interested in having conversations with those of us who would be critical of Black conservative analysis, even as we then might be also critical of white conservatism, even when wrapped in Jewishness and Zionism. So that's sort of my point. The ADL and its peers support a media environment, whether it's run by Jews or not. They support a media environment that is largely conservative, largely pliable and malleable, and supportive of their interests. And then have the ability to create the situation that leads to Kanye's, and then to benefit from it when Kanye and others make these kinds of comments that are taken out of context, or are themselves out of context because they don't know the context. And I would argue that, look, I don't know. I'm not saying Kanye is not capable, but I've seen no evidence that he does understand the context of these comments and politics and histories. And since he's explicitly said he doesn't like reading books and doesn't want to support people who read books, but he wants to be called a doctor because he's been given an honorary ED degree, EDD, not a PhD. So that's what I'm saying. It's not that he can't learn because he's an artist, but I'm saying he hasn't demonstrated that he does put in the effort to understand or understands these contexts. But people who do are not invited. They're not encouraged, largely because they would likely end up taking a leftward political position that would make the ADL truly upset, much more so than the easily picked on comments of a Kanye West and the snippets of a Farrakhan speech. Same thing again. To the average Black American, Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam have no meaning, no relevance. Let's just be real. No disrespect. Let's just be real. Unfortunately, the politics I and others on this platform espouse have maybe are equally without meaning for many in our audiences or our peers, our communities. But the idea that the ADL can promote that Farrakhan is giving the marching orders for Black America is ridiculous. And if so many people could be easily manipulated by Farrakhan's message, well, what is it happening out in the world that is allowing for that? And that's sort of what I'm saying here. If Farrakhan is manipulating or has an impact on Black communities, that has as much to do with the conditions those Black communities are in and the shaping of their education and media environment as anything that Farrakhan is doing. And what I'm saying is, I'm not saying Jews are constructing that. I'm saying that Jews and the ADL in particular, and that political wing of Jews, are not doing their fair share to improve the national conversation. During an appearance on the Hip Hop News Uncensored podcast, NOI Executive Council member and student minister Wesley Muhammad stated that Kanye West is speaking a lot of truth right now, and he's triggering a very dangerous enemy. I see him, with good reason, threatening to go DEFCON 3 on Jewish execs of Hollywood. Jewish execs of Hollywood are those who are the Wizards of Oz, responsible for the carnage that has become hip-hop and become Black life as a result of the commandeering of hip-hop. So on the one hand, we might say, look, there needs to be a more sophisticated analysis offered by Wesley Muhammad. But on the other hand, if we look specifically at the industry and the executives involved, they likely are Jews. And the industry has had a negative impact on Black community. So if we don't want the analysis of that to come from Wesley Muhammad, we would want to promote the analysis of that to come from somewhere else. My analysis of that is very different from Wesley Muhammad's. But my analysis is going to be equally rejected from the ADL as would Wesley's, leaving room for the Kanyes to get their comments and others to get their comments in, because there's no discussion of, well, why are so many Jews in position in these industries? There is an answer for that. There is, I think, one that could be explained through neocolonialism and Western imperialism. In short, Jews are set up in areas of the economy to run aspects of the economy in society's institutions that the Gentiles and the cohort of leadership that exists don't want to run, or didn't want to run at the time that those industries are being constructed. Remember, to the elite, to the ruling elite, pop culture has always been seen as the playground for the buffoons, the low class, and those to be sold or turned into consumers or worse. So their attitude was, let the Jews run it. We don't want to run it. And then the beauty of it is that when it turns into something, when it becomes recognized as the weapon it is, the Jews could be easily scapegoated, as was the case going back to Pontius Pilate. If you believe in any of that, which I don't believe. I don't even believe any of that. I don't even believe people even know what really happened back then. He just remember a lot of story. But the point is, if you believe that story, it's the same scapegoating. Oh, by the way, you could. It's easy. People could. And I know it's already happened. People say, "Oh, well, his mother's a Jew. That's his bias." I get it. Yeah, I am. This is my analysis is not unbiased, but my analysis is not born of my bias. Similarly, by the way, those without Jewish mothers also have bias, and I don't know that they've checked theirs. I don't know that they've put in enough study, requisite study, to check their balances and their biases, rather, that I feel like I've done with mine. But I acknowledge that they exist. Although I don't know that my bias would include a defense of Jews per se. My mother, absolutely. And all those surveillance documents of our family suggest that they didn't take advantage of whatever privileges they had. They did quite the opposite. But the point still remains. Whatever. My point is, if my bias needs to be checked as well, my analysis needs to be critiqued as well. But ultimately, my point is, that analysis wouldn't be welcomed into the mainstream discussion any more than the views that the ADL so happily and routinely wants to condemn. But again, I'm not just picking on the ADL randomly. I'm speaking about them. I want to create a couple of overlaps here that I don't see being made, even as I know people by the time you see this video are sick of this discussion. But as I noted here, Jews, like all other groups, are popularly represented by their worst, those who have captured power in this ignoble world or been prominently placed by those who have. Their internal contradictions, like Black people, are not reflected, perhaps told from the opposite pole, but nonetheless still not at all there is to tell. So that's, again, something that I think gets lost in all of this, so much of this forgetting that the versions of the groups we see interacting in mainstream commercial media, pop culture, are often the worst versions of all of those groups, and yet they stand in as representatives of those groups. I wanted to pull up this story here from Haaretz, which is often depicted as the liberal left-leaning paper of Israel, dominant newspaper in Israel. Kanye West doubles down on anti-Semitic tropes, rejects invitation to Holocaust Museum. What did I? Oh, I think I couldn't create a note on this page. So what I did was, let's see. So what I wanted out of this was, let's see. Let me find. Nope. Disney. Okay, this was what I was looking for here. This is my exact point. Jewish people have owned the Black voice, whether it's through us wearing a Ralph Lauren shirt or all of us being signed to a record label or having a Jewish manager or being signed to a Jewish basketball team or doing a movie on a Jewish platform like Disney, West said, offering a number of anti-Semitic tropes. So, but this is sort of, yeah, this is why I highlighted this, because this is the same point I was just making, that even Haaretz is kind of doing the same thing that the ADL and everyone else does. But Jews are in prominent positions in management or ownership, in sports, in media, in all of the major intersections in the economy and society where they meet Black people. And those relationships are hostile, or at best employee-employer. They're not equal. So, but does Haaretz ever want to explore why that sentiment exists in Black America? Or do they ever explore the overall net impact that those industries have had and continue to have on Black communities? So that's what I, again, continue to find to be unfair in all of this. We'll hold up the comments of a Kanye or someone else, but there's no investigation as to where it's all coming from other than to dismiss it as anti-Semitic or the rantings of a celebrity lunatic probably going through some mental collapse. And if he is going through some mental collapse, why? And if why is that? And if people don't like, as I've seen some Black writers and others saying, I don't like Kanye and I don't like Dave Chappelle and I don't like this one and I don't like that one, but I don't hear enough of the criticism of how is it that these people get placed in the first place to have such a prominent voice in these issues, never mind areas of comedy or music or art. And none of that was decided upon by Black people. Black people did not select Chappelle and Kanye as our spokespeople. The people we often do select to be our spokespeople get marginalized, assassinated, exiled, or left as political prisoners to this very day. I don't want to hear what Kanye has to say about Jews in Israel. I'd be interested to hear what Mumia has to say about Jews in Israel. I'd be interested to hear what Assata Shakur has to say about Jews in Israel. Okay. So I went back and found something from a couple of years ago in the Boston Review that speaks a little bit more to my concern about the ADL and why I am often, unmoved by how these conversations take place and what they mask. Maya Gelman from 2019. All the links to what I'm using will be in the show description. The Anti-Defamation League is not what it seems, written in May of 2019. So again, remember, part of my argument is that the ADL helps set the national agenda, doing domestically what the Occupation of American Mind documentary shows Israel does, or really Zionism does globally, in projecting critiques of Israel, critiques of Jews as de facto anti-Semitism, preventing any institutional analysis. And I think in this case, I would add to what I'm saying today, what I've been saying today, that it allows for Jews to themselves not do more to participate in contributing to the national and global discussion, an honest national global discussion, national and or global discussion of the relationship of Jews to anyone. And in this case, specifically Black people here in the United States. This story starts is in the context of condemnation of Ilhan Omar and what she is said to have said and what it's said to have meant. But as this piece says here, the Anti-Defamation League, a Jewish non-governmental organization based in the United States, whose stated mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment of all. All right, so just to give it what their expressed mission is. A well-worn pattern, the ADL's calls to action to have successfully mobilized public opinion against Black leadership for decades, from Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Ocean Hill-Brownsville parents in the New York City teachers' strikes of 1968 to the Movement for Black Lives and Mark Lamont Hill. So in the context of Ilhan Omar's comments of a few years ago, in this issue of dual loyalty among Jews between the United States and Israel, the ADL came out condemning her. And this article, I think, does a good job of resetting the context for what the ADL is and what its context is for making claims against others of anti-Semitism, and particularly those in the Black community. In a clear sign that the new class of elected Democrats has actually shifted some power, though, the congressional resolution on anti-Semitism took a surprising turn. Instead of confirming the innocence of the Israeli lobby, as the Democratic leadership intended, Congress was forced for the first time to repudiate Islamophobia and white supremacy alongside anti-Semitism. And this little concession, by the way, is seen as a negative by the ADL. And I think this article does a fantastic job of explaining why. This Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, the bill would create federal authority to decide whether a critic of Israel is motivated by politics or anti-Semitic intent. Why is it? I went it down there. Okay. It would insulate anti-Semitism charges from public debate, where efforts to equate Israel with Jewish liberation increasingly fail, and where new Black Muslim Jewish alliances against Israel are emerging. By the way, I think this is an important point. Again, I'm not advocating some sort of anti-nationalistic hand-holding. What I am advocating is this understanding that, again, all groups are encouraged prominently and in terms of their public spokespeople and imaging towards conservatism and reaction and hostility and anti-Blackness. So whenever there are efforts to coalesce along non-conservative reactionary lines, those like the ADL get bothered. So as it says here, the stakes are high for the ADL because its moral authority is a moneymaker. The ADL and its fundraising foundation reported combined total of $67 million in contributions in 2016 as Donald Trump took office and neo-Nazis marched in Charlottesville, including at least $11 million from fundraising events. In 2013, it raised $750,000 in one night from its furniture industry's partners in the fight against hate, one of its favorite phrases. So they make money. There's money to be made off of ringing the bell of warning. The ADL celebration of Trump's Jerusalem, right? They celebrate conservative policies, does the ADL, and that support Zionist colonialist goals. The ADL's ubiquity in U.S. discussions of white supremacy is exceeded by the Klans, only by the Klans. More than 2/3 of the 46,000 articles on white supremacists or white nationalists posted in the past year have referenced the ADL. That coverage has spiked by 1,500% in 2019 alone, based on Factiva database searches for terms white nationalist and white supremacist. So what this article is saying is that the ADL dominates popular discussion and, again, seeks to set the agenda for how discussion of white supremacy and its abuse of all different groups is to be interpreted and responded to. At a time when it should be easier to see the ADL as a conservative knowledge production agency, a resurgence of the concern with hate has only consolidated its power. So again, for all the discussion around Kanye, the ADL and its parallel peers in the political media atmosphere are able to resituate themselves as something other than conservative knowledge production agencies. It's the same thing I was saying around like the Freddie Gray protests and all that other stuff. All these ignoble conservative leadership groups and organizations can prominently rebrand themselves as legitimate and progressive in the face of all this quote unquote hate. The ADL's power to mobilize against Black leadership does not rest on leveraging anxieties about anti-Semitism. It draws instead on the ADL's much broader authority it has won over anti-Black, anti-immigrant, and anti-queer hate. It is a quasi-state role that the ADL developed in just a decade throughout the 1980s, the period of collective U.S. desperation about white supremacist violence preceding the one we are in. So again, they use the anti-Semitic lane to take over all lanes in this quasi-state role of addressing ourselves to anti-queer, anti-immigrant, anti-Black hate. The ADL has evinced a strong allegiance with the U.S. state. It was committed to its civilizing mission of settlement and to capitalist individualism as the framework for rights, in addition to keeping watch over threats to the state, Nazism, communism, or demands for equality that went too far. The ADL sought out or welcomed ways to participate in the administration of the state. It collaborated with the House Un-American Activities Committee in the late 1940s and 50s. It also tried and largely failed for several decades to interest the FBI in considering it a partner in monitoring threats. In fact, the FBI had to end up surveilling them for violence and hostility. The ADL's quasi-state role took shape from 1979 to 1990. Not incidentally, these years were the period of crisis for Israel's image as a liberation project. Decolonizing states in the United Nations charged Israel with colonialism, racism, and violations of international law. And Jewish economic and political inclusion in the United Nations was soured by the advent of critiques of white privilege. Sounds very similar to today. So I don't have a smoking gun or evidence of a conspiracy, so to speak, in this particular regard. But again, it can't be seen as an accident that the narrow and the narrowly held ranges of political discourse benefit the most reactionary. In this case, the ADL benefits from helping to limit and narrow discussions of Jews and their relationship to Black and other communities, so that when people spout out what they can easily dismiss as anti-Semitic tropes, they can rebrand themselves as anything other than conservative production agencies. In 1979, the ADL began producing an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. These audits, which found that anti-Semitism was on the rise nearly every year, were soon taken up by media and policymakers as a measure of how well the United States was living up to its values of racial inclusion and how imminently threatening were latent fascist forces. That's really deep. And this is sort of, again, my point that, again, whether we're aware of it or not, the ADL has had a lot to say about national media and policymaker conversation around so-called anti-Semitism. And in this case, as this article started off with, the monitoring and policing of Black spokespeople and groups. Beginning in the mid-1980s, the ADL launched work on hate crimes legislation. This momentum put the ADL in position of writing essentially national curriculum, not just on anti-Semitism, but on anti-Black, anti-Asian, and anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racism. In more than one instance, this curriculum was implemented over the objections of Black, Asian, Arab, and Muslim communities. So it's easy to dismiss people who in the 80s, like Len Jeffries and others, raised a hand about how Black education was being constructed in defense of or by Jews. But what was really happening was, at least part of what was really happening, was a conservative overlay led by conservative Jews in the ADL to position the ADL as being able to teach the entire nation's children of all backgrounds about the oppression and the racism their communities face. And imagine it's Jews telling Arabs and Muslims and Black people how those communities should see and interpret and respond to hatred coming from white communities against them. Of course, AIPAC is involved, is related to all this, but you know, the ADL's victory in San Francisco was confirmed by the confirmed the ADL as a voice speaking beyond Jewish interests on a universalized, collectivized civil rights. And what they're talking about is the San Francisco victory, or the victory in San Francisco that the ADL had in imposing its curriculum in public schools. The ADL can simultaneously endorse blanket surveillance of Muslims as a matter of security on the war on terror and provide anti-Islamophobia curriculum to school children. I mean, as a result of running workshops and developing curricula all throughout the nation's schools, again, the ADL can monitor what other communities are doing and inspire those communities into certain directions. Perhaps the most effective aspect of the ADL's victory was to virtually displace from education those anti-racist organizations, local and national, that sought to discuss racism and white supremacy in terms of state power and dispossession. The ADL had labeled Black-generated anti-racist education projects extremist and anti-Semitic. Going back to what I was saying earlier, you don't want a legitimate conversation because, like my man, like Eddie Murphy said in life, you don't want to give me a gun, boss. I might shoot you with it. You don't really want to hear what I have to say because I might verbally shoot you with those words. So the ADL's continued role as an authority on white supremacist groups in the present points to its consolidation of control and its sidelining of the Black-led groups contending for that space in the late 1980s. It's worth noting that anti-racist organizations from California to New York are still fighting with local school boards and universities over a world of difference. That's the name of the ADL's curriculum. And other ADL curricula that Anti-Semitism Awareness Act proposed this year aims to empower the Federal Department of Education to characterize Palestinian human rights demands as violations of American Jews' civil rights. Wow. As Arab communities were being disenfranchised by the ADL, they were also being subjected to intense violence. So this is some of the violence that was happening in the 80s. A lot of people forget, just how violent the 80s were in terms of anti-Black, anti-gay, et cetera, communities suffering violence. And then, so this article actually helps in reminding of that. And one of the reasons why we're still where we are is because so much of the encouraged response politically, interpretively, et cetera, has been constructed by reactionaries. This article also does something to remind of another very interesting history. The extent of to which the ADL's antipathy towards the left was briefly a matter of national discussion in 1993. In 1992, FBI agents noticed that some of their intelligence on the Nation of Islam had appeared in an article written by ADL staff. A few months later, they raided the ADL's office. Alongside with classified FBI data, they also found that the ADL had a much larger collection of illegal files. So the ADL was like, the FBI isn't spying on Black people enough. We got to do our own. A second set of dossiers came from surveillance and infiltration by ADL staff and consultants. For at least 3 decades, the ADL had targeted civil rights groups from liberals to revolutionaries, anti-apartheid activists, legal advocates, including from the ACLU, and community groups. The ADL also surveilled ethnic representational groups, particularly Arab and Black, and Jewish groups concerned about Israeli treatment of Palestinians. In total, the raid found dossiers on nearly 950 organizations and 10,000 activists. The ADL's conception of a leftist threat had already been guiding the organization for decades. In the 1980s, this idea had cohered in neoconservatism. See, again, why are there, again, I'm not seeking to justify or whatever, but as an analytical explanation, perhaps, for where the comments of a Kanye might come is not only is, again, the encouraged centering of celebrity, the creation of celebrity, and so on, that, you know, we talk about always, and, you know, but is the idea that the ADL is itself, and what my point really is that the neoconservative, the colonialist agenda of these conservative groups is not made part of the conversation, as we are meant to hear from them directly or indirectly their condemnation and critique of Black and other spokespeople. The ADL's conception of a leftist threat had already been guiding the organization for decades in the 1980s. This idea had cohered in neoconservatism, but in civil rights circles, the ADL did not acknowledge its hostility to the left. Instead, it portrayed itself as progressive and anti-racist to its left, as rogue and misguided, if not marginal. SNCC and Black liberationists had hijacked the real civil rights movement, New Jewish Agenda were outliers who really were anti-Semites. In the 1980s, according to the ADL's spy, Roy Bullock, the ADL's anxieties focused on groups critical of Israeli policies, such as anti-apartheid groups, which Bullock also categorized more simply as anti-democratic movements. In the present, the ADL has continued to militate against internationalist intersectional anti-racism and has used its status as the nation's premier civil rights organization to do so. In particularly painful example, in 2016, the ADL's director wrote a critique of the Movement for Black Lives policy platform using the Black spiritual phrasing of the civil rights movement. He told them to set aside intersectional bonds with Palestinian resistance and instead keep our eyes on the prize. Wow. At the same time, the ADL has consistently used the language of civil rights and its position as an authority on them to describe Israeli state military violence as liberatory and Palestinian resistance, including nonviolent civil resistance, as extremist. Anyway, so I just wanted to take a little bit of a look at the ADL with that article and its political situation historically and today, to look at its engagement in critique of Kanye as a way to try to identify and explain why I think Kanye exists in the first place, as both an artist, celebrity, and as someone positioned to speak on these issues, so that we can't have the level of discussion and discourse that we deserve, that might lead, of course, to the kind of politics that those in power, including the ADL, don't want to see take hold. And why I think so much of these conversations around this or that celebrity are disingenuous. So I bring it up all the time. It's a book I refer back to on a regular basis, but it's just something I wanted to come back to just very quickly, just a little bit. In Neil Gabler's work, An Empire of Their Own, How Jews Invented Hollywood, it's just something I don't know. I think it's important to be reminded of. And I just want to share just a little bit of his introduction here to sort of make the point of what to make a point about what I think does not happen very often. As he writes here, Russian Jewish immigrants came from the shtetls and ghettos out of from the shtetls and ghettos out to Hollywood. in the magical place that had no relationship to any reality they had ever seen before in their lives or that anyone else had ever seen. They decided to create their idea of an Eastern aristocracy. The American dream is a Jewish invention. Joe Robinson. They, the Jews of Hollywood, not only believed in the American dream rather than see it fail. They not only believed in the American dream, rather than see it fail, they tried desperately and successfully to manufacture the evidence for its survival and for its existence. And this goes to the point I was getting at earlier, that Jews escaping one reality constructed by Europeans came over here to construct a new reality for another set of Europeans, all of which institutionally set them and pit them against colonized communities, particularly Black people. It's not about a conspiracy. It's not about the Jews, etc. It's a historical explanation for how we are where we are that no group seems to want to discuss. And Jews who have a particular possible relationship or potential to do it don't do enough to advocate that that discussion happen and may not be positioned to have it happen. Again, they were given space to create and invent the Hollywood specifically so that it would perform a function. Were they to use it to perform another function, they would probably lose control over it. That's why, again, I think historically it's interesting that it wasn't Jews, even within Hollywood, who were the first to condemn Hitler. It was the Gentiles who thought they had more room to do so because the Jews didn't want to be seen as making any noise. They didn't want to abuse the space and access that they had achieved. There was one more section here. Right, talking about the amount of Jews who were involved, movies were their chief form of propaganda. Because, okay, so this is what he says here. This is actually pretty interesting how Gabler puts this. The most powerful talent agencies were run by Jews. Jewish lawyers transacted most of the industry's business, and Jewish doctors ministered the industry sick. Above all, Jews produced the movies. Of 85 names engaged in production, a 1936 study noted 53 are Jews. And the Jewish advantage holds in prestige as well as numbers, all of which led F. Scott Fitzgerald to characterize Hollywood carpingly as a Jewish holiday, a Gentile's tragedy. The real tragedy, however, was certainly the Jews. Their dominance became a target for wave after wave of vicious anti-Semites, from fire and brimstone evangelicals in the teens and early 20s who demanded the movie's liberation from the hands of the devil, and 500 unchristian Jews to red baiters in the 40s for whom Judaism was really a variety of communism and the movies their chief form of propaganda. So it's kind of like what I was saying earlier. Jews put in a position to prominently play a role in a society that sets them up to be blamed for what that society is doing and then they use anti-Semitism as a mechanism to defend their performance in that colonial project here domestically and internationally via the defense of Israel and Zionism. And almost nowhere are these issues or topics invited for legit and honest discussion. So we're left with the forms that we end up with. And that's really, that's basically what I don't know. That's just some of what I wanted to try to argue in this episode, to try to put forth that, because again, I know we're all tired of Kanye and whatnot, but this issue is going to come up again. And I hope that my argument here helps us develop that interpretive lens and response that will be more helpful than, oh, I just don't want to hear about Kanye or the tropes we fall back into that we're encouraged to. That as funny and or as sometimes they are, and as hateful as they often are, don't really lead us to the kinds of analysis that we need and an understanding of the world that we need to get out of it, to change it. So, all right, good people. Let's wrap that one up for today. Again, please, all your responses and thoughts, share them.
Put it in the comments.
I hope that you get the point of what I'm trying to say here.
Message.
Maybe some of you are still just, saw the cover and the title and just
no, God, no.
Or
It's wrong, bro.
But, anyway, listen, make sure you do all the things, click all the things, like, share, subscribe, do all of that good stuff. Definitely stay safe. Like Fred Hampton used to always say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, checking this out. Catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like and all throughout the platform here at Black Power Media. Peace, everybody. Catch you next time. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
They say when you wear Black Power Media gear, you can accomplish anything. You play any and every position. Coaching, to kicking, to receiving, to running and juking. And, oh, my goodness. Let's see that again in slow motion. Get off me. And you're going to have a lot of haters coming at you. But what you got to do is you got to shake them off, and get to your goal and accomplish it. And when that's done, it's a beautiful thing. I'm talking about going hard, extra, for that extra point. And when it's done beautifully, you talking about touchdown. Oh, and the crowd goes wild and they're celebrating with you and everything. Man, let's see that again. Nice.
Black Power Media, baby. That's how we do it.
Now go to blackpowermedia.org and get you some of that gear. Empower yourself today. Yeah.